lighting all right for everyone? We've either got the option of this kind of nice soft lighting. I'm a bit worried about people falling asleep. The other option is it's really bright. So, is this okay? Yeah, good stuff. Okay, welcome to this second session on Agroforestry. My name is Jo Smith and I work at the Organic Research Centre. Just as an indication, how many people were in the last session of Agroforestry? So you'll probably hear a little bit of repetition. So Harriet introduced the system at Dartington, and we've got Ella who will speak in more detail about that, but hopefully the two will complement each other very nicely. So this session is focusing more about new opportunities in agroforestry. So agroforestry is all about making the systems more complex by introducing new elements, new tree species, for example, and it raises lots of new opportunities, right, from new tree crops to new working relationships, and gives a nice way in for new business partnerships as well. So we'll start with Ross Dickinson, who's made his way up from the southwest, and I'm just wondering why I've lost the... I might have just switched as well. Technology, it's wonderful. And Ross, perhaps you'd like to...
Introduce
yourself as we go.
Yeah, hi, my name's Ross. I'm a farmer from southwest, in fact West Dorset. I mean, some of it will come up later on, but we're a small family farm of about 400 acres. And a long time ago, we stopped flailing our hedges other than by the roadside, and we went over to a continual coppicing regime. I finally got round to asking the question, was it economically a good idea in the last year or so? And I should have obviously asked myself that question when I was in my 20s, not in my 60s. So the other reason that I actually did this work was the potential effects of Brexit on the farming community. So that if, as been suggested, we lose our area payments, the DPS payments, it could be pretty catastrophic for the marginal livestock farms across the country. So, for example, on the edge of Dartmoor or Exmoor. And it was just looking at a tiny contribution to changing the farming economic dynamics so that possibly they could save a few £1,000s a year and make a few £1,000s a year. It's not going to be the answer, but it might just help some of the more vulnerable farms rather than the land being abandoned because it's fundamentally unprofitable. Very good.
Okay, thanks, Ross. good time.
Right.
I'll pass over to you. So we'll ask speakers to talk for about 15-20 minutes,
Okay.
and then we'll have questions to address that afterwards, and then a more general discussion at the end of the session.
Right. Good to go, I think. Yeah, we'll launch into it. There will be a lot of facts and figures and things, and if anybody wanted to, was interested in it, there's an email address there, and I would happily ping them across a little paper I wrote about this, which will have all the figures and, in fact, in more detail than this presentation.
Right. Can I share that presentation when we share the form?
Absolutely, yeah. Right.
Yeah,
Okay.
she's not doing her job. No, I'm multitasking. Terribly.
As I say, the farm's about 400 acres. It's a low intensity organic grass system. We used to be a dairy farm, but we couldn't keep up with it, so we decided to supply a bigger organic dairy farm with crops and forage and so on. So the field sizes are a bit crazy. A lot of it is medieval field systems, so some of the fields are 1 acre, and the biggest one is 30, so it's a real old jigsaw, but it does mean there's a lot of hedgerows. The farm is pretty high for Dorset. It's 400 to 1,000 feet. There are 12 miles of hedgerows on the farm, and 10 miles are in a coppice rotation that me and now my son Ewan do together. The growth rates on the hedges is below average, but not as poor as if it was by the sea or, further north. Okay, so it's one of the things that we do is we have a small firewood business. because now we're not milking, we do have the time to do other things. Right. Okay, that was the question. I think it's important to say that on the continent they're way ahead, and they do total chipping of hedgerows for biomass, but it's low-grade chip, and there is a problem with a lot of boilers in that they don't like the slithers from low-grade chip. So currently in the UK there isn't a viable market for this rough chip. If in time that market develops, then that will be the way it'll go, and it won't be my way. They will be doing this total chip for biomass, but at the moment that's not happening. The example I'm going to give you today is, it's not a template, but my hope would be that there might be things of interest to farmers that they could take away with them and apply to their own circumstances, or indeed actually people who want to work on the land, because there are some opportunities here for them to come into the countryside. This example I'm going to give you today requires no special skill set, no specialised machinery. Our log business is below 300 tonnes, but up to 300 tonnes, a two-man log business can actually get going on about 20,000. So in job creation, it's £10,000 a job, which is very low in terms of capital requirement. You just need a beaten up old truck, an old tractor, and a few other things. Okay, so really just trying to say that what we do, if they wanted to, anybody can do it.
Sorry, Ross, before we go any further, that is it 300 tonnes that would employ two people, the revenue from that?
No, it wouldn't. It would be part of their living. So it would be, the profit on that we'll come to in a minute. But what it would do is, if you wanted to move and work in the countryside, it would give you a viable living over some very difficult months of the year, i.e. the dead of winter. Okay, good. Right. Bit crazy, terrible marketing. So that's how we sell our logs. We sell them in old cake bags through an honesty box. We have an ice cream pot, and people just take the bags, leave the money in the pot, and we probably put about £15,000 through the ice cream pot. So here's all the logs. They're air dried. We try to be 12 months ahead. We hardly ever make it. We get the moisture down to about 20%, but it's just hard to keep up with it. It is sort of always trying to turn into a monster where me and you do nothing else but chop firewood forever. So it has to be sort of controlled. Very good. Okay, so for this business, where do we get it from? We get a certain amount from the hedges. We do about half a mile a year, maybe a bit more. It's quite interesting that because it's a commercial business, it does stimulate our neighbouring farmers to coppice their own hedges. So it acts as a sort of hub for a wider hedge laying maintenance programme than our own farm. I mean, there was one really nice instance of a farmer who's in a very small way. A lady from London bought a farm with some very big hedges. She said, you can have the fields if you deal with the hedges. So he had the use of the fields. He chopped the hedges down, sold me the firewood. So he, you know, for somebody who's in a small way, it was an opportunity rather than some huge burdensome cost. We get given fallen trees, we do a bit of tree surgery, we thin some copses, and if we don't have enough, we buy in loads from the big timber companies and break them down with chainsaws. But I'll come on to all that in a minute. So these figures, we've increased our prices by 10% since this was done. So it's slightly better than the figures that you'll see here today. So the average selling price is now about £200 a tonne. Gross income is probably 33,000 now. Very good. Okay, so what are we producing from this? we're producing ordinary saleable logs. Now, the trouble with hedges is they produce a lot of what I call ugly sticks, which is wood that the public don't want to buy. I mean, biomass is biomass, but they don't like irregular, ugly shaped bits of wood. They just don't like it. So the other things we produce is, when you get all the little rods in a hedge, you get the cobs and the hazel rods, we have a machine called a branch logger, and we feed it in. It looks and behaves a bit like a chipper, but it chops it into chunks. And I've just left my twigs and cobs out there somewhere. So we sell it in the back of an old pickup truck. Now, this hedge that I actually broke all the figures down from was 220 metres long. So that is the amount of what I call ugly sticks that you get from 220 metres. We're a bit like the Waltons on our farm. There's 4 generations of us. We have 8 log burners, and we use all the ugly sticks that we can produce. I do have other markets for them, in that I sell them for camping fires for holidaymakers and things like that. They're too big to go into cobs and not big enough for the public to buy, but we use it all. Okay, very good. I think that's enough on that. Right, this is a hedge that Ewan and I did last winter. If you are interested in going over to doing this type of regime, it's very important that you select the right hedges. So you've got to look at species and access, and consider everything about it. It is hard work and sometimes quite marginal, but the hedge I selected is a typical hedge. Constituents were 25% thorn, sycamore, ash, hazel, holly, willow, and so on. Our hedges are, I did actually, when I was coming up here, look at the rather pitiful hedges around here, and I thought, oh my God, they're about a foot wide and blackthorn, so it'd be a complete no-no. But they're big southwestern hedges with lots of different species. They're big, they're wide, and almost always on a hedge bank where we are. The variables in what I'm going to talk about are very considerable, but one of the variables is, where is this hedge growing? So within 2 or 3 miles of where this hedge is, the hedges would grow almost twice as fast, because it's grade 1 soil, it's warm and it's sheltered. But where we live, it's windy, it's high, and exposed. So the hedgerow, these figures you're going to see today could be a lot better if I was on a better farm, if you like. Okay, so it's fairly near where we process them. Had an old fence both sides. I did this one at 15 years, and when I think about it, on this farm at these growth rates, it would have been better to leave it to 20 years. The figures would have been slightly better. You'd have had more output, even though you'd have a little bit more work. It would have been more profitable to leave it to 20 years. Okay, very good. Right, so how do we go about it? Well, ironically, the first thing we do is flail them. So we hit into the brambles hard, and anything that we don't like, we hit it as hard as we can with a flail. But it doesn't take very long, and it all looks a bit peculiar because parts of the hedge are hit hard. But if you've ever, got bogged down in bramble, it is the most depressing thing, and you can't afford to spend that amount of time just pulling brambles out of trees. All the work's done with small chainsaws, and as we work, we separate it into the products as we're going to do it. We also tidy up the standards from previous rotations, and we tend to have more standards than we ought to, so that they're laying down firewood in 20 years' time. We might halve the number of standards and take more firewood. But so our standard density is not 1 every 40 metres, it could be 1 every 20 metres. So as we're working, the actual material that we put through for the kindling material from the branch logger, it's very important that you obviously don't use thorn or holly or anything like that. So things like sycamore, ash at the moment, it's all stacked as we chuck it and work, and it actually, before you know, you're doing it without thinking. So you're already separating out the products as you're working along the hedge line. Still a lot of brash, even though we do take a lot of it, a lot more than most people do, but there's still a surprising amount of rubbish coming out of the hedge, which still has to be burnt. We don't use any log processors or anything, because a lot of the material we get is not straight and perfect, and they tend to jam up. So we just do it with log splitters and saw benches. I also don't like being driven by machinery. In fact, if you over-capitalise and invest in your farm machinery, it just means you've got to produce a lot more to keep the whole show on the road. So I think, you know, farming in general can get pushed by its machinery. So it's just processed all through these things, and as I say, we like to try and sell all the wood at about 20% dry matter. Okay, good. Right, so what did this 220 metres of hedge produce? It produced 9 tonnes of logs we could sell to the public, 6 tonnes of stuff that we couldn't, but we can use it ourselves, 99 nets of cobs. These are the cobs here. They're like little chunks, but we can sell them all to people that own boats or yurts or glamping businesses. We don't have a problem selling that at all. And the other thing we produce is these boxes of this, which is just kindling twigs. It's the tops of the hedge. I could produce a lot more, but I can't sell a lot more. So I'm probably selling about 30% of the total viable brash, no more than that. But
what do you do with the excess?
We burn it.
In situ.
It just gets burnt with all the rest.
How do you cut that?
We have this little thing called a branch logger, and it behaves like a chipper, and it's a ferocious thing. If you have 2 men loading it, it's as fast, it'll take it all in, and it takes another man as fast as he can go to change it. It drops into nets, and it's as fast as you can go to change the nets over. So it probably does.
So it is cutting rather than.
Yes, it's got a rotary blade, a rotor with the blades on it, and it cuts it at sort of 4-inch lengths. Everything goes through it. But you can do about maybe 60 bags an hour.
What's it called?
It's called a branch logger.
Branch
And the one I have has come from Czechoslovakia. It's imported through a British firm in Lincolnshire. Okay, very good. Right, I'm not going to get too bogged down in all these figures. If anybody wanted to look at the figures in detail, you know, they can do. They'll email me or something. But the only thing I would say about all of these figures is that I did do them at a living wage. I think it's absolutely pointless trying to, you know, mix and match your figures, and then actually you can't expect somebody to do that work at that rate per hour. And when I actually did these figures, I didn't know whether it was going to work, and I was starting to sweat because it's a pretty ferocious cost for 220 metres of hedge. I did it on what we will accept down where we live, which is pretty rural. Talking to my cousin who farms in the Greenbelt in the southeast, he said that although the labour price is probably £2 or £3 an hour higher, he could sell his material for double what I can sell mine. So it all depends where you are in the country. But this is the figures for where we are, which is sort of rural southwest. I timed all of these things. I did the abstraction and so on at the rates that I would be prepared to do it as a farmer for a neighbour. So that's, you know, they're not set in stone, but they're roughly viable where I live. So we come to a pretty horrible cost of 3,300 and something. Good. Okay. Yeah. So what was the income? Well, as you probably all know, the real key to this is the saving in flailing. So I spoke to several of my neighbours and I averaged out the saving price per metre, and I came to a figure of 35 pence a metre is the average flailing cost. So then of course I timed it by 15. If I'd left it for 20 years it would have been a little bit better, but it gets you off to a good start. So it gets you off to, how's my maths, not great, say £4.50 a metre in saved expenses. And the nice thing about it is if you were in financial straits and Brexit has struck and you weren't getting your area payments, if you stop flailing, that is an immediate savings / income in the very first year. So it would start to affect the farm almost immediately. So this is what we sold things for, and we ended up with a profit of £1,500 on this hedgerow. I completely avoided government support, subsidies and things like that because I wanted to do it naked, if you like. I wanted to see actually what it was like without anything. One, because I'm hopeless at it, and also I think it's, at the moment especially, a bit dangerous to rely on government support. So, I mean, somebody did point out to me that there is a coppicing grant of £4 a metre. If you can get that, it just brings the price up. So on a 15-year cycle, if you did achieve the coppicing grant, it's about £10 or so a metre. Right, that's good.
Can I just, on the,
Yeah, do.
on the annual saving
Yeah,
bit, is everybody flailing their hedge every year?
yes.
And then do you literally not have to touch it again for 15 years once you've done this? Or is it
I don't, and some people, I was talking to Natural England at some other place, and they said, are you concerned about the hedges growing out into the fields and taking up area that you then get you into trouble with your area payments? I suppose that is a potential risk, but quite a lot of the hedges, the cows eat off the sides as you go along and the sheep can shimmy in under. And I'll sort of meet that when I come to it, but it is a potential problem, I think. But we probably lose about 2 to 3 metres each side of the hedge in growth into the field over the 15-20 years. So that is an encroachment into the field that, you know, it is a disadvantage. And of course, to get it straight, once you've got all those roots, it, you know, is an issue.
I was going to say, you don't get it back on coppicing necessarily, do you? Lots of land.
Well, what we do actually is we go in with a plough without any discs on and smash up the root systems. So we do take the field back to the hedge line. I know. Okay, so I mean, this is a hedge that we finished, and that's what it looks like when we finished. You'll notice there's a lot of standard trees. The bluebells loved it, and although you think, my God, you know, where's the hedge gone? But it's all there, and it will coppice out and come up. And that was this particular hedge that we did. There are too many variables in what I'm talking about for it to be an absolute guideline to anybody, but the principles should hold true as a generality. So one of the things that is a real variable is the work rate. I'm in my 60s and averagely fit, but no more than that, whereas when I'm working with my son, you know, his output is twice my output. And so, you know, if you're a fit, strong young person, you know, it's one of the few times in the modern world where you actually can, you know, it's to your advantage. It really is to your advantage because you can motor along and get the meters done. So, I mean, I have sort of thought in my mind that are there young people in the cities, perhaps especially young men, who don't want to look at computers, they don't want to boss, they maybe don't have a great deal of money. You know, wouldn't it be great maybe if some of them could come out to the countryside and start earning a living and, you know, maybe having life or a life near to what they wanted. I don't know, but it does occur to me that there is an opportunity here, because it's no good saying, oh well, the farmers will do it all, because a lot of farmers are too busy. You know, they've got their cows or whatever they've got to do. So there is potential for people to come back to the countryside rather than leave it all the time. Okay.
Can I just ask on that
Yeah.
picture, sorry, just going back to
Yeah.
that picture. What's your expectation of the hedge coming back up again, and then how long do you leave it?
We leave it for 20 years,
Yeah, 20
and
years.
it will come back thicker than it was when we cut it.
And you'll have some primary trees in there?
We never plant any trees.
No, that's what I mean, so you'll have some of those trees that you've got there?
Yes, indeed.
As well as the hedge?
Yes, so this is one we left in this cut, and the second one was the rotation before. And so we have lines of standards, and then I won't do it, but you and hopefully will, if you need more.
Hedge is about this high now. Oh, is it? From that picture?
Yeah, they grow like hell because of course they've got mature root systems.
Can you get before and after picture?
I didn't get them before.
So,
Yeah. Right.
Ross, on a similar sort of line to that, you say you never plant any trees, so when
No.
you go in there, you've got hawthorn in there and stuff, and you
Yeah.
get some pretty gnarly old,
Yeah,
if it's been laid in historically, and it could be,
yeah.
you cut them down and
Yeah.
they all just
They
come
all
up,
just come up.
everyone.
Well, I wouldn't say everyone. Some do better than others, but the compensation for most of them outweighs the one or two that fail. But they are massively resilient. In fact, the biggest problem with hedges is not that they're cut too tight, it's that they're never cut, and they grow out and die and become a line of trees. So it actually stimulates the hedge to thicken up and grow like hell.
Do you fence the livestock out there? Down?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, people have said to me, well, what about the fencing costs? But actually, after 20 years with modern fence posts, the fences are knackered anyway because the posts are all rotten. So whether you did this type of thing or not wouldn't make any difference because the fence would have to be done anyway.
Do you use electric fencing?
Sometimes we do, but we mostly use post and barbed wire.
They do.
Yeah.
So with the standards, they never go beyond 20 years?
Oh no, the standards will go on forever. Hopefully into big, mature hedgerow trees.
So you're just maintaining them?
Exactly, just tidying them up, stopping them getting in the way of the tractors.
When do you decide on what's the standard?
Well, I think that's quite interesting because when I go to things, there are the learned and the good who have huge debates about what to plant or what to leave. And when we're working, it takes us about 10 seconds. You know, you just look and you've got a straight 15-year-old, 20-year-old oak tree, which has been forced up by the other stuff around it, and you just don't cut it down and move on.
But these are all hedges that are hundreds of years old?
The hedgerow systems some of them are pre-Norman conquest. They're
Have you
beasts.
ever started on new hedges?
I have, but I don't tend to coppice a newly planted hedge. I tend to lay it twice before I coppice it, but to give it some body. It would be a bit brutal to shade it down to the ground straight away. Right, disadvantages. There are some disadvantages. So you get shading, so crop retardation. You also get crop retardation due to water shortages. Some lost land, you do lose a bit. Occasionally you'll get a tree fall out, especially towards the end of the coppice rotation. So for example, if you're growing very high value crops, you probably wouldn't put a hedge into this sort of regime right next to them because the disadvantages for the value of that type of crop would be too high. Okay, good. Well, we may or may not get some money or whatever. This is all a bit airy-fairy, but the natural capital of the farm is increased. I did see some figures done by a private company for Devon County Council for highways, and the values that they put on lack of flooding, stopping pollution, stopping noise, the numbers were really massive. So with Brexit and what we could be facing with environmental inputs, then that is something that could be of significance for the future of farming. If you are making a good job of managing your hedgerow systems, it may be that in some way the government will reward that. I mean, who knows? So you've got the savings in flailings, so you can pay a living wage and do it at a profit. So for a lot of farms, and I'm looking at the low intensity farms like ours, we might go out of an afternoon and do an afternoon of this and do so many meters and then go and do something else. So it's quite useful because it can fill out our day in a constructive way, rather than just sitting in the kitchen worrying about the farm. Which is, you know, no, but it can indeed happen. If you want, if you are worried about, if you're too busy, this system would allow you, if you can sell that sort of type of product at those sort of rates, to employ somebody, or they can do it freelance and take the firewood. But it is viable for somebody to do this work. You know, it's hard work, and they're never going to get rich, but it's viable. And again, they may have some other jobs, so it's a job where you can come in, do a few hours, go and work in a bar, do what you want, mend a car. It's quite nice like that. Right, I mean, I won't go on about the flora and fauna because there are a lot of people that are much more, sorry.
No, I was going to say briquettes.
Yes.
You've never thought of making briquettes out of the waste, so to speak. Have you thought about it?
I haven't thought about it because you need a lot of sawdust, and we don't produce enough.
Right.
And
So you have thought about it?
well, you're right. I have thought about it and dismissed it. I mean, we rattle along as fast as we can, and our output is tiny. You know, it takes me about an hour and a quarter to break down a load of rounds of wood into logs, and a ton is nothing. And you know, we seem to spend hours and hours working, and you know, you look at the heat and think, my God. So the idea of doing any more fiddling is not attractive. Right. So, yeah, I think I'm not going to talk about flora and fauna because I'm not an expert, but you will all understand that for the wildlife, it's got to be good because you've got some hedges down to the dirt. So you've got things like foxgloves coming up who are waiting for their moment and those sort of things. And then when the hedge is 20, 30 foot high, it's good for the bats, you know, and all through. And I don't know enough about it, but I think
there's an argument that says the trouble with high trees in hedges is that you get the raptors in them, which
Indeed.
kill off the smaller creatures.
Well, they've got a place as well.
I think I would be pretty confident that the voles are, you know, they do kill off the voles, but not enough to stop them. So, I mean, the thing that interests me actually is the last one, which is sustainable renewable energy production. Right, I mean, I like messing around with these figures, but what I did is I converted the wood into the heat equivalent output in terms of oil or in terms of energy, because I'm interested in the idea of very tiny systems contributing to slowing global warming. So this 220 metres of hedge produced 88 megawatt hours of heat, electricity if you like, and that equates to about 8,500 litres of heating oil. So
what's that cost these days?
well, it's about, say, if it's 50 pence, you know, it's a figure. So it's not as good as heating oil because it's not as flexible and you're carrying log bars and things, but at least you haven't got to service your boilers. So there's some carbon sequestration in the hedge while the thing's growing, but there is some permanent carbon sequestration in the root systems because you've got big root systems. It will help with reducing runoff and flooding you know, these great big hedges, they're pretty formidable in terms of stopping runoff and filtering stuff. I mean, if you say you made some terrible mistake and had a big flood and you got a lot of manure, it would intercept a lot of it before it got to the river. Yeah, I mean, I think that people don't notice hedges in a way in a landscape, but if we didn't have them, our countryside would look a lot poorer, just aesthetically, you know. So I think it does have some bearing on tourism and things like that. Yeah, right. Well, I went a bit mad here. So there's 500,000 kilometres of hedgerows in Britain. In Devon, you could go to the moon and back and have a few thousand kilometres left over alone. So that, you know, they're formidable lengths of stuff. Okay, we'll go on to wild extrapolations. Very good. Right, well, there's Ewan, and this is the sort of thing that we have where we live, which is a hedge bank, and you'll see it's a pretty formidable sort of thing, and he's coppicing on top of there. Right. Okay, well, just to go...
Yeah, sorry.
That's all right, Sally. I'll try and do a few from memory, but if 5% of the hedgerows in the UK were put into this type of system, it would produce, on average, 160,000 tonnes a year of viable biomass, which is, you know, and I can't remember all the other statistics, but there's one that sticks in my mind, is 617 gigawatt hours of electricity each year could be produced in heat equivalent. Anyway, the point is that these figures are at 5% of hedges selected for this. That there are, one I do remember is it would equate to 12,000 full-time jobs. Now, the way I did that was a 40-hour week for 50 weeks of the year by the man-hours it took me to do this hedge. Now, that almost certainly wouldn't happen, but what you would have, hopefully, is many tens of thousands of people coming out and doing an afternoon of viable work inside the rural economy. I think that one of the ways to look at this is, I spoke to somebody in Dorset and they said well over £1 billion a year leaves the county in terms of fossil fuel payments. Now, if we could just hang on to a fraction of that and keep it inside the county and in every county, instead of it going to Russia and Saudi, it can only be to the good of the rural population and possibly even the country.
Ross, we do have the figures here. Do you want us to plug them in and for you to go through them?
I think the general idea is that it's a lot of stuff if 5% of the hedges went over to this sort of regime. It is so wild that they're pretty much meaningless, but it's just a lot of everything. If 1 metre in 20 of hedges were put back into this type of work.
Can I just ask a completely different question? You see the bank there?
Yes.
That wasn't created by the hedge, was it?
No, they were built in our part of the world. They built these great big banks and put the hedges on top of the banks.
That was a demarcation, was it?
Yes.
Yeah.
Different sorts for the early hedge banks follow soil types, so that the field inside that hedge bank system behaves in the same way because the soil is the same. So they tend to be pretty snaky and follow the soil rather than the rectangular later hedges.
Okay.
One tiny bit of question about how you manage the hedges alongside the roads.
We flail them.
But how do you do you just side them up?
I made a mistake with that. That's a very good point. I went a bit mad and I thought I'll leave the inside of the hedge for my regime, and I flailed half of the top and the roadside and let the other half grow. And then after 20 years, a complete nightmare, because as we were cutting the hedge, some of the material was almost falling into the road and we had to pull it back into the field.
I see, so that's an issue.
It was a failure.
If you coppice alongside the road, you've got a road traffic accident problem.
Hedges on roadsides.
We copied our hedge on the roadside though, but we did it in a shorter rotation and then chipped it.
Right.
And
Yeah, I mean, if it's on a short rotation, it's easy to just pull the stuff back. The problem is what you, if you're just going to, is it just a loss, or are you going to do something with the product? That's the issue.
Can you tell us please how you reckon a ton of flour in terms of say, cubic metre?
Yeah,
Because
There is
you're not weighing it, presumably.
well, I do actually. What I do is when I'm
With nets you can, but
yeah, when I'm working, I have a big bucket on my machine, and I know that is in volume 3/4 ton of loose logs, and I fill up my bucket. So that's how it is. I have in the past weighed sections, but it all got a bit.
that's wet weight or dry weight.
Exactly. All these weights are based on 20% moisture. In other words, saleable weight.
Sorry, we didn't quite get it. So how much do you sell a cube for?
Well, a cube of solid wood,
Yeah.
if you like, which is something like 2.3 cubes of logs, is sold on average for about £200 a tonne. That's about the figure that I achieve for them.
Oh, don't do that.
Okay, last question then, because we really need to
Well,
move
I'm
on.
just going to ask if those two trees are ready to harvest.
No, they will be left to grow into big standards.
Okay, right.
In fact, that's probably the third rotation that they've been left for.
Okay, the one on the right looks as though it's getting there.
No, we'll just let them grow into big trees.
I think you could sell your wood for more than that.
It's not a very wealthy. Hope so.